Well, I think I'll jump in there. I know we're still letting a few people in from the waiting room into the main conference hall. Thanks for joining us and welcome welcome to NHT's online training. And I'm Andy Wars, and on my left or on my right, depending how your screen is configured, is Beverley Haywood, and we're talking today about appraisals and difficult conversations. And this is a taster for the course we've got coming up next Friday, which Beverley will run for us. So hopefully you get a taste today of the course, and hopefully you're interested enough to want to book onto the course. Our aim today is to help you plan. No, it's not. Our aim today is that from time to time you'll have difficult conversations with people who are apt to challenge you. What we want to do today is offer practical tips and strategies that you can use effectively with these situations and emerge with your leadership, your professionalism, and indeed your sanity intact. I'll just say a few words about Beverley, a few little tips of housekeeping, and then we'll get going. Beverley Haywood is a head of representation and bargaining here with us at NHT. She's an expert in advising and leading training on handling difficult conversations. And I can say that with confidence because I've seen her run a course on this. She originally qualified as a solicitor, and she's worked in HR in various sectors over the past 20 years, including the educational sector, the emergency services, and private industry. She's also a governor and a board member of a multi-academy trust. So that's what you're going to get today. I hope that's what you signed up for. Just a few tips on housekeeping. It's a Zoom conference call. You've done many of those by now, I'm sure. Beverley will be doing a slideshow. We'll share the slides with you afterwards. If you look at the participants, whichever name you chose to be known as will appear down the side there, so you can see what you've decided to call yourself, what everyone else is called. We can't change that, so that's what it is. And we have a chat function down the bottom, so while Beverley's presenting, if you have any questions, rather than interrupt Beverley's flow, stick them in the chat and we can pick them up at the end. Or if you want to chat to each other while Beverley's presenting, please feel free to do that. And we'll have hopefully plenty of time to open it up to be interactive at the end, and we'll have a poll. So that's the format. That's enough of me, and Beverley's set up and ready to go. And if Beverley starts sharing your screen, we'll have the presentation. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Good morning, everyone, and hopefully you can all see my screen, and thank you, Andy, for that introduction. Can I just check that everybody can see that? Andy, is that?
Yeah, that's you come up clear and fine there, Beverley.
Super, thank you. So what I'd like to do first of all, everyone, is just give you an overview in terms of the objectives of this session. And as Andy's outlined, it's very much just to share with you some practical hints and tips in terms of dealing with some of the difficult conversations that you may face. So although the first part of this session is very much focused on appraisal, the latter part of the session really is just to cover general principles about dealing with challenging and difficult situations. And I thought it might be helpful just towards the very end of the session, just to touch upon parental complaints, because I'm acutely aware, having dealt with and supported members over many, many years in dealing with parental complaints and carer complaints, how incredibly challenging, difficult and emotional they can be. So I thought that might be helpful to you. So first of all, just to cover the objectives of this session, what I'd like to do is really to talk you through how, in terms of an appraisal process, you may need to lead a difficult conversation with an appraisee. And I think that's particularly apparent where things aren't going terribly well with a member of staff. And also just to explore with you why people can be challenging and why you might need to have a difficult conversation with a member of staff, or indeed it could be a parent or a governor, or it could be a representative from your own employer. And really some hints in terms of helping you prepare for a difficult conversation and dealing with some challenging and difficult behaviours. On a more positive note, I'd also like to offer you some support in terms of approaches to building positive working relationships with individuals. And I think one of the key tenets of that really is about managing expectations. And that really is key for me in terms of trying to avoid difficult conversations, or indeed deal with them if you are involved with those sort of conversations. So we'll look at some steps in terms of managing behaviours, managing difficult behaviours. And as I said earlier, just to touch upon how you might deal with parental complaints. And that final bullet point there is by no means of any lesser importance, because what I'm finding, particularly since we've had the COVID pandemic, is really the chronic pressure that our members are under. So it's really just a reminder about your own well-being and really your own health and safety, and to make sure that you're not losing focus on that as well. So in terms of difficult people, difficult behaviours, I think it's important just to reflect upon why people can be difficult with you, why you perceive them to be difficult and challenging. And I think what's really important, of course, is that we're focusing on the behaviour here, not about the individual. And just that first bullet point there, I'm sure you've all met those individuals where people have said to you, oh, it's just so-and-so being so-and-so. You know, that's how they are. They're always like that sort of thing, because that's what we know of their behaviours. But also, of course, it could be because that individual themselves is having a very, very difficult time. They may themselves be going through personal or professional challenges that you may or may not be aware of. And it could be that unwittingly or otherwise, we actually contribute to those behaviours for reasons that we may not be aware of. We may tolerate or condone behaviours that we know are not appropriate because it's just easier to let things go. And I think we've all been there. It could be also that they're retaliating against something that they don't agree with or they object to you doing. They may be fearful or frightened of change or something in the workplace that's causing them concern. And that first bullet point there really in many ways is linked to the first, the final bullet point is linked to the first one. The behaviour itself could be learnt behaviour. And I think quite often you see that in children, don't you? They just don't know how to behave any differently. So in terms of how difficult behaviours can manifest themselves, it could be, of course, that an individual has a very firm view about what they want. You may not agree with that. Could be a parent, it could be a governor. And they may think that actually what they believe they want, they actually have a right to that. So they do genuinely think that it's their entitlement to have what they're requesting of you. And I don't doubt that many of you on this call today actually have been subjected to very personal affronts and very personal slights and comments about you. Because when people do feel anxious or angry, and then that manifests itself in a difficult behaviour for you to deal with, they can make matters very, very personal. And it could be that those individuals simply will not take no for an answer, regardless of how you try and rationalise and explain what you're trying to do. They may broaden their challenge. So initially it could be about one particular issue that they're not happy with, but that can very easily broaden into other areas that they're putting to you that they're clearly discontented with. The individuals may feel victimised, singled out, harassed in some way. And that penultimate bullet point there, I think is a really key one, because I suspect that many of you this morning have been with individuals who've spoken at great length about how they feel and are very passionate about those feelings, and they're almost trying to abdicate responsibility for those feelings onto you, as though you should be justifying that that's an appropriate way to feel or that's the right way to feel. I've certainly been subjected to those sort of situations, but actually you're not responsible for how other people feel. Of course, what you are responsible for is how you behave and how you conduct yourself, but not for how that might manifest itself in terms of how others might feel about that. And I think that's a really important point to take away today. And of course, as we all know, sometimes people may hear what you say. People often say, "Do I hear what you're saying?" Whether they actually listen to you is another matter. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later this morning. So in terms of preparing for and dealing with difficult conversations, and it may indeed be that you can't prepare for them, you're just having to face them. But if you can do, try and think about when you might need to have a difficult or challenging conversation so that you can start to prepare for that. And the reasons why it might be not only difficult for you, of course, but equally difficult for other individuals who may be involved in that conversation. So think about the circumstances that you might be met with or that you might have to deal with, and where those difficult conversations might take place. Of course, you would want to avoid having them in a public place or in the playground. So try and prepare and think about those situations that you think might be challenging. So within that context now, what I'm going to talk you through are a few slides about the appraisal process. And I'm going to preface this part of the discussion in terms of the COVID pandemic, because I'm acutely aware of the extraordinary year we've had, and I don't doubt that that will continue, certainly for the foreseeable future. And the challenges in terms of trying to manage people's performance in the context of the spectacular array of changes you've had to face, guidance documents you've had to follow, and then changes again to those guidance documents, changes in legislation, changes in government policy and protocol, and how extraordinarily difficult that's been for you in trying to support staff and manage staff and just get them through this whole process. Of course, in addition to that, your whole school community and your pupils as well. So I'm very mindful of that in terms of these slides about an appraisal and a performance management process. And indeed, if you've got any questions you want to put to me, then by all means put those in the chat box, and through Andy, I'll do my best to respond to those. But certainly the guidance that we've put out alongside NGA and ASCL is very much to take a pragmatic approach in terms of objectives that you set with your staff and how you monitor those objectives going forward into this year and beyond. So in terms of appraisal, a critical document, of course, for you is your appraisal policy. And that really should set the framework and the guidelines around how you manage people's performance. And alongside that, of course, will be your school's pay policy, because of course, inextricably, the two are linked. So any decisions that you make about pay for teaching staff really should be linked to your appraisal policy. The teacher standards are a key performance measure in terms of monitoring a teacher's performance and how they're progressing against those objectives. And it may be that yourself, you are being monitored against the head teacher standards. They're not compulsory, they're advisory, but it could be that your governing bodies and your trust boards do use those in terms of supporting you in managing your own performance. It could be that there could be some Ofsted requirements that you've enshrined in terms of your own school development plan that then feed into individual development plans. And also, of course, what you'd be looking to do is to monitor on an ongoing basis how people are doing. So although midterm reviews are not compulsory, I would strongly advise that there is that regular monitoring process just to keep people on track. And equally, that applies to yourselves as well, so that really you're not in a situation where ultimately staff are being surprised about any performance judgments that you're making. So with the teacher standards, as you'll be aware, part one of those standards very much focuses on the teaching, on pedagogy in terms of the actual progress for pupils, outcomes for pupils. So what you'd be looking to do is setting objectives with your staff in terms of inspiring, motivating and challenging the pupils. And with that, of course, and with that context, what you'd be looking to do is enable that teacher to demonstrate good subject knowledge, good curriculum knowledge. so that you're enabling them to demonstrate that they're planning lessons well, they're structuring lessons well, and that they're able to adapt their own teaching methods to meet the strengths and the needs of those pupils. You should also be exploring with your staff what sort of assessment measures you're going to be making, so that you're looking at a diverse range, enabling your staff to make accurate and productive use of all methods of assessment. Behaviour, as you're all aware, is absolutely critical. And again, looking at objectives to enable staff to demonstrate that they're managing behaviour effectively and fairly and consistently, to demonstrate that your children are in a good and safe learning environment. And of course, what you'd hope to do as well is to afford an individual an opportunity to demonstrate a wider professional contribution to the school, in perhaps supporting other staff in their own development and the wider school community. So just looking at the standards in practice, of course, what you're looking to do is identify the behaviours that you'd be seeking, the skills that that particular member of staff has, the knowledge that they have in the context of your own individual school setting. And of course, every school setting is different, and every school is a dynamic environment. So you'd be looking for evidence. And again, I can't stress strongly enough the criticality of your evidence in terms of managing people's performance. So you'd be looking for things potentially like feedback from parents, feedback from pupils, peer feedback, any moderation outcomes, task observations, lesson planning, moderation exercises. So it's really a wide spectrum to afford that member of staff maximum opportunity to demonstrate to you that actually they are meeting the standards that you expect of them. In terms of part 2 of the teacher standards, of course, what you're looking at there very widely are the visions of your school, the aims and objectives, and the values that there are at the very heart of your school and what you're trying to achieve for your pupils. And then also how all that translates into practice in terms of that individual's measure of performance. So look to each member of staff in terms of your overall school development plan, talk to them about that and how they can feed into that. And then ultimately, how practically what you would expect their contribution to look like in terms of those performance measures that you have for them. The next slide, as we all know, a very emotive issue, and I'm sure many of you have dealt with challenges where you've not recommended a member of staff for pay progression. So it's so important that you're getting the evidence lined up, that you're sharing that with that member of staff, because of course what you're trying to do is link and reward that individual teacher's contribution to the school to any pay increase, so that you're incentivizing them to progress and to continually improve in terms of their own practices and contribution. And the criticality of evidence, as I say, I cannot underestimate, because it could well be that you're facing challenges around that, as in, well, what is your evidence for that? How can you support the fact that you're not going to recommend me for a pay increase? You may face some challenges from trade union representatives around that as well. So your evidence really is vital from all those sources that we touched upon earlier. So the quality of your appraisal system, the integrity of your appraisal system really is key. And of course, your policy is a fundamental document in that respect, but it's about the application of that policy that really is important in terms of trying to avoid any challenges around performance management. And it should be a supportive process a developmental process, and that applies to you as well in terms of your own performance management. So that actually demonstrably you're using the tools within your appraisal process to support that individual in terms of ultimately progressing through the pay scale. And your pay policy should make it very explicit about how your appraisal outcomes are linking to any pay decisions. And your staff should be very, very clear about that. And if there's any doubt, you need to be exploring that at a very early stage so that you're confident, that your staff can say with confidence, I'm absolutely clear about what I need to do to try and secure a recommendation that I go through the pay scale. And if you're in any doubt about that, then check an individual's understanding on that. So in terms of your judgments about your pay progression, recommendations around that, again, what you'd be looking at there is an assessment against the teacher standards in terms of the objectives that you may have set. And I realise that from March last year onwards, you may have had to completely review those objectives for individual members of staff because of the challenges around lockdown 1, 2 and 3, and having to adapt your teaching methods, teaching approaches and access to teaching so that you're affording that member of staff an individual to still continue to be awarded a pay increment. So it could be that your objectives have been vastly different to last year for your staff, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as they are still SMART objectives and that they're still achievable, your staff, in the context of the challenges that we're all facing at the moment. But you should still be looking at how you can demonstrate that there's been a positive impact on pupil progress and wider outcomes for pupils. It could be that with a particular member of staff, you're looking to support and develop them in specific elements of their own practice. And again, you might be looking at how an individual can contribute to other staff and look to develop them. It could be about remote learning or different approaches to teaching, given the challenges that we're all facing. But still, you should be looking at evidence from a wide range of sources as far as you possibly can do, even in the current climate that we're all working in. So the appraisal process, of course, is a cyclical process and really starts with your school priorities, your school development plan, team priorities, and then filtering down into individual performance objectives. And what, of course, should contribute to that is any individual career plans that people might have, individual objectives that they might want to achieve. I talked earlier about the importance of regular monitoring, and that really is important. And it could be that actually there are no issues or no areas of concern, but I still think it's very valuable to identify that and just reassure that person that they are on the right track. And then, of course, what you'd be looking to do towards the end of the academic year is to have that overall assessment of performance, reviewing those individual objectives, with a view, of course, to feeding into any pay decisions. Now, we all know that sometimes things don't quite go as rosy as what we might hope in terms of managing people's performance. People sometimes have real difficulties, they have personal challenges, they go off poorly, which can add to the difficulties in managing their own individual performance. So with that, where you are experiencing those teachers who might be struggling with their objectives, the critical thing is to offer that support and that guidance. And if you're not sure about what you think that might look like, ask them, because ultimately it's about that mutual engagement with that individual, again, to try and avoid those challenging and difficult conversations that you might have to have. And as we know, one of the key factors here is about listening to people. You may have a very firm view on the fact that they're not performing and why they're not performing, but do take the time to listen to issues around that, because there could be something that you're not aware of that is really key in terms of why they might be struggling. And I think you need to operate from the premise of all teachers should look to progress, and you should support them through that progress and look to award a pay increment unless there are really serious issues of concern. And as I say, and I make no apology for saying this, please do put things in writing when things are going well, but also, of course, if things aren't going to plan. So in terms of what you should be doing throughout the appraisal process, you really should be giving that written feedback about the nature of areas of concern or areas that you think need some development, because you may well need that if you're challenged on that. And so that there's no ambiguity either for you or indeed for that staff member around that. And you really should be affording the teacher the opportunity to comment on that, discuss those concerns, and afford their response to that and their input into that. And what you should be doing is affording the teacher 5 working days notice of a meeting to discuss those areas where you've got concern and where you're looking for areas of improvement. And with that, of course, identifying a programme of support for that individual and guidance for that individual. And that's not for you to impose that on an individual. It's about that mutual dialogue around that, so that ideally you're agreeing that support plan and those areas of concern that you believe will be addressed through that support. Talk to the individual about, for you, what progress will look like, how you're going to monitor that, and how you're going to review it with them. And always afford them a right to be assisted or supported by either a work colleague or a trade union representative that actually should be quite helpful. It may not seem like it at the time, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you must afford them that opportunity. And again, that final bullet point there, so important. Make sure that you are making it searingly clear to that individual about the potential implications if there is no improvement or if there's insufficient improvement. And that's not about threatening an individual, it's just about being clear with them what you expect to see, but the potential ramifications if those improvements aren't realised. Because I would not want you to be in a situation where you're facing a challenge from somebody who's saying, you never made it clear to me, Beverley, you never made it clear to me, Rachel, Sarah, about the potential consequences if I didn't meet that objective. And as difficult as that can be, I'm very aware of that, you really must do that. So in terms of the next steps, what of course you'd be doing is monitoring your appraisal process with reasonable time for improvement. And many members say to me, well, Beverley, what's reasonable? There's no black and white answer on that. Of course, it depends upon the children's learning and the impact upon the children's learning in terms of what you need that teacher to do. Now, if there are very serious and acute concerns around that, my advice to you would be have a relatively short time scale around that in terms of that time for improvement. But if you think actually the concerns aren't so grave, you might look at a time scale of say 6 to 10 weeks, if not beyond. Be mindful, of course, of as well as school breaks within that period. And again, what you'd be looking to do is to give that regular feedback on the performance during that monitoring period. And again, look to monitor that, look to revise that if need be. Don't be afraid to do that. It's about a supportive process for the individual. As I said earlier, schools are dynamic environments and the status quo rarely prevails for very long. So if you need to modify targets or timescales, then do that. So perhaps more positively, if there is sufficient progress, again, you would still look to have a pre-agreed formal meeting with that individual, whereby if the evidence, and I stress the evidence, is such that the teacher is judged to be performing at a level that indicates that actually there are no longer any concerns around their performance, then you would look to just continue the appraisal process. However, if things aren't going quite so well, then what you would need to do is to invite that teacher to what's known as a transition meeting. Now, what I would stress at this stage is this is not part of a formal capability process. This is a meeting to determine whether or not formal capability processes may need to be invoked, or whether you can just continue on with your appraisal process. So really it's a meeting to discuss and explore how things are, what areas of concern there may be that might be outstanding. But if you're confident that actually within a particular timescale with the relevant support, that individual is in a position where they're able to meet the standards you expect of them, then I would suggest you just continue with your appraisal process. And again, you'd be looking for that individual to be assisted by a representative or a workplace college. Give them 5 working days notice of that meeting, and be very clear who you may need involvement with at this stage. It could be that you'd be suggesting that an individual mentors them, or that there may be a key stage leader who you think might be able to afford somebody some support. Talk to the individual about that and about their role. But you need to be really clear about why you would suggest that person is introduced to help them. So why are you saying that they need to be involved, and what will that look like as well? And by all means, afford an individual some input into that, because they may have a view on who they think might be able to help them. And again, I think you need to be receptive to that. But the critical thing is that that role is clear to all parties, and the contribution that that person should be making to support that individual. So I invite you to reflect upon what you believe you need as an appraiser and the requirements that are on you to undertake this process. I think absolutely you need to be confident and honest in your assessments, so that evidence in terms of your assessment is key. And what you might be looking to do is to formulate your judgments against the standards, teacher standards, part 1, part 2, the particular requirements for that job, the objectives that you've set for that individual for that appraisal period. And of course, absolutely what you need to be confident of in terms of your evidence base is any pay recommendations that you might be making to your pay review committee. These things take time. I'm very, very aware of that. So give yourself the management time to address these issues, to formulate your evidence base, to talk to any individuals who you think might be able to help that person. It's so important that you give yourself and make that time to try and avoid any future challenges. And again, make the time to address any areas of concern in a timely manner. Don't wait. As difficult as it can be to manage people's performance, particularly people who can be notoriously difficult in their behaviours, notoriously challenging, it's so important that you do that, really to nip things in the bud, and so that things don't fester and that you're not perceived to be condoning any shortfalls in their performance. So do act in a timely way during that appraisal cycle or when a problem's developing, And as I say, don't wait. That actually concludes the first part of this session. I realise it's been a sort of brief overview in terms of some hints and tips in dealing with appraisals. I was going to propose that we do have a very, very short break, but if there are any questions that you might want to put to me through Andy, I'll happily take those. And then I suggest we just have a very short 5-minute break. So I'll just sort of open it up to the floor, as it were, for the time being. Andy, are there any questions at all on the chat function?
Not on the chat. Obviously, people have been watching you very carefully and taking careful notes, because lots of information there, and I'm sure people have been scribbling down hints and tips and making the most of that. Just the inevitable question: will we get the slides? Yes, you will get the slides. We'll send them out to everyone on the call. And indeed, we record the webinar of this, and we put that on our YouTube channel, so you get the delight of watching this again if you'd like to do that, and indeed all of our previous webinars. The course we don't record, because the course we get more interactive and people tend to bring issues that are directly affecting them, and we speak in a greater length and in more confidence about things. So yeah, so to answer that, yes, everybody will get the slides, so there's plenty of time to recap on things. If people want to ask a question, we're talking about 30 odd of us in the room. I mean, feel free to pop up. Probably the best thing is to pop up on screen and unmute yourself if you fancy asking a question. I now know nobody will want to go first, because this was quite difficult. But please feel free if you've got a question, and jump in. Nobody seems to want to. I think probably. There we go. Dawn, are you going to come and join us, Dawn?
I am. I've got ICT problems like the whole world, I think. I'm just wondering if you've got any suggestions for targets that are reasonable given what everybody's going through. You know, I've got 2 tiny schools. We've got a complete range in children that are very well supported by professional and well advised and well supported parents at home, and children that are out on farms all day and, you know, not able to attend Zoom sessions, etc. So for the teachers, it's not a particularly even playing field. You know, everybody's working their socks off, but as for making things measurable, that's my challenge. How do we make anything measurable with appraisal reviews?
I think, Dawn, what you need to do is be realistic with your 2 schools and your teaching staff about actually what is achievable, given the diverse context of the families that you're dealing with and their differing sort of socio-economic backgrounds and occupations and so on of the parents, and possibly even the facilities that your children have got access to. So you know, as you'll appreciate, I know I can't give you a black and white answer on that. What I would suggest you do is engage with your staff about that, to say, what for you, you know the children probably to a greater degree than I do. So what do you believe would be as stretching as it can be in terms of the blended learning that the children may be involved in at the moment, in terms of the home environment of those children? Because again, Dawn, I would hazard a guess that the teachers know those to a greater degree than perhaps yourself or other appraisers. So I'd be saying, let's look at what is realistic for the remainder of this academic year, about what, you know, for example, we may want pupil X to achieve within the context of that environment, but more broadly, of course, for you in terms of your objectives. So what can I do to help you in terms of, you know, that, if you like, bubble of families who may have that access to learning, another bubble who may perhaps be more advantageous in terms of facilities and support from families in terms of their own learning. So I would say work with your staff on that. I think for me, given the COVID pandemic, it's probably more important than ever that you're engaging with your staff about how you can support them in terms of realising what objectives you can do, just to, let's face it, Dawn, get through this academic year safely and as productively as you can do in supporting the families that you're dealing with. In fact, I was on a call yesterday with a multi-academy trust, and I asked them, you know, what are you doing about objectives and supporting staff in meeting those objectives? And they said, we're just being as pragmatic as we can be, Beverley. It's basically nothing's black and white, nothing's in stone. We're just asking our principals and heads to say, do everything you can do. Keep the children learning, keep them engaged, keep them safe, keep your staff safe. Be very, very mindful of the well-being of your staff and supporting them in terms of their own well-being, and basically work with them in terms of objectives that are realistic for them. So that's the advice I'd give you, Dawn.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question in the chat. I'm not sure how this break is going to work. Perhaps if people desperately want to go out and grab a coffee, do that now while we're going through these questions, and then Beverley can do the second half of it. Quite happy for you to read the question out. Thank you. It says, bearing in mind the damage to learning that has occurred, how will this impact on young teachers beginning in 2019 and 2020, 2021? I mean, it's a really good question, because I had someone saying yes, on the wellbeing course, I took up my headship in September. I don't know what it's like not to be a head teacher in a pandemic. I hope it's not quite as hard as this. It must be really tough for newly qualified teachers coming in. How do you think, Beverley, that sort of impacts on the kind of conversations people need to be having?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Andy, in terms of having those conversations. And I think that really is the critical thing, so that senior leaders are demonstrably supporting all of their staff, be they NQTs or otherwise, in terms of the challenges that they're currently facing. Because, of course, you know, we all have lives outside of school, and it could be that, as we all know, our staff themselves may be facing family situations, family bereavements. They may be dealing with people who are shielding, or indeed who are suffering from COVID. So I think the critical thing is that dialogue, to make well-being really at the forefront of your staff management, staff support, and I suppose really try and give staff the confidence that we will get through this, because we will, and that things will be different again, maybe not in the very short term. But I think it's about the fact that if people can go through this change and this unprecedented, extraordinary situation, just to try and give them the confidence that actually they will get through it. And when they get through it, they will come out the other side, probably, maybe in many respects, having learned a huge amount in a very, very short period of time that they may not hitherto have done were it not for COVID. So I think it's about having that dialogue, making sure, of course, that you are recording conversations as appropriate. And I say that cautiously, but it's so important that you can demonstrate as a leader that you are giving that support, that you're targeting that support for each individual member of staff, and that ultimately that well-being really is at the top of the agenda.
Okay, great. Yeah. Certainly something that came through yesterday was sort of the phrase, "This too will pass." I think when you're stuck in the middle of it, it seems like it will never end. But this too will pass. You know, the Spanish flu epidemic of 100 years ago eventually passed. This will pass, and we'll move on to happier times at some point. I don't have any other questions in the chat at the moment. So, Beverley, do you want to crack on with part two?
Yes, I will do. I'm mindful of time for everybody.
Yeah, I'll drop out and let you do that.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, so what I want to do now is really just to explore more broadly some of the challenges that you may face in terms of dealing with difficult behaviours, difficult conversations. And some of those bullet points I know will resonate with all of you in terms of how demanding people can be. So it could be that they may want you to take a particular course of action that actually you don't believe is right, or actually legally you may not be able to do. They may believe that actually they should have something or have access to something that you don't believe they should be having access to. They may claim that you're bullying them or harassing them in some way. It could be, of course, that you're facing individuals who may be threatening you that they will go to their trade union and seek advice and support from their trade union. And I'm sure many of you have had that threat, however thinly veiled, put to you. There may be a challenge too that you're actually trying to treat somebody differently for whatever reason to another member of staff, or that you've allowed somebody to do a particular incident or involve a particular incident or do something that you're not affording that individual the opportunity. It could be, for example, that you've permitted somebody to have a day off during term time when actually you're now refusing an individual to do that for what you believe to be very legitimate reasons. And again, I don't doubt that the final threat there about somebody going off sick or you're compromising and having an adverse effect on my mental health and well-being has been put to you. And all these, of course, can cause you anxiety and feeling that actually it's going to be a very difficult way forward for you. I've used a sort of cartoon graphic on the next one because I think, again, this could be really familiar to you in terms of dealing with challenging and difficult behaviours. So not only could that be somebody that you're dealing with, be it a child or a parent, governor, staff member, you could often feel like that, deeply, deeply anxious, frustrated, furious, upset. These are all normal human emotions, of course. And if you reflect upon what you may have tried in terms of dealing with some challenging behaviours, I have no doubt whatsoever that you've tried to be reasonable in explaining to an individual why you can or can't do something. You may have tried to explain that position rationally with an evidential basis to your rationale. I don't doubt that you've tried to be very fair and consistent in terms of managing and dealing with people. And as appropriate, you need to be robust. You need to be tenacious in the jobs that you do. I don't think anybody could be a head teacher if they weren't on occasion. Day in, day out, you have to make very, very difficult decisions and be robust and resolute in making those decisions. It could be that given how you've been feeling, you may have just felt like giving up. Maybe you have given up on occasion just because it's just been too exhausting and you've been too jaded and overwhelmed by the situation. And you may have just walked away in terms of that fight-flight approach because, again, it's just too much for you to deal with. We touched earlier on the importance of managing expectations. And again, I really hope you'll reflect upon this because it's so important that you're managing people's expectations. And I very frequently hear our members say, well, I said to them, Beverley, you know, if they've got any problems, come and talk to me. I've got an open door policy, come straight to me if there's any issues of concern. And I invite you to reflect upon the consequences of doing that. Because if, for example, I was a parent and I heard you say, I've got an open door policy, pop and see me anytime if this is worrying you, that's probably exactly what somebody will do. And is it always wise to have this open door policy, to use the metaphor otherwise? Because there will be instances, and are instances in your role, when you need to concentrate, when you need time, when you need to be in a situation where you're not being distracted. So be very, very cautious about the language that you use in terms of what you're offering people. And it could be, for example, that you say, I can see you later today, tomorrow, but I can't see you now. Or it could be that you say, yes, I've got 5 minutes now, but I haven't got 50. And I have no doubt that on this call, probably every one of you will have met somebody who said to you, oh, have you got 5 minutes, John? Or, Janet, can I just have 2 minutes? And then there you've been 30, 40 minutes later, worrying about a governor report you have to do, worrying about a parent who's waiting in reception. So be very, very judicious with how you use your time and try and manage people's expectations from the outset, because that'll probably go a long way to alleviate any anxieties you might have and also to avoiding what then might become a very difficult conversation. So in terms of clarity around people's expectations, people may be very clear about how to raise issues with you, Could be through a complaints procedure or whatever it may be. But try and make sure that they're clear about what you expect in terms of their own behaviours around that. So you may well have a homeschool protocol or code of conduct that you expect parents to adhere to and comply with. But again, don't be afraid of making clear your expectations about the behaviours that you would expect people to demonstrate. And in terms of the principle about how you manage your pupils, the principles are just the same. You're probably likely to talk to pupils about the expectations that you have in terms of their behaviours. This is not about them as individuals, it's about the behaviours that you expect people to demonstrate. And it's the same for all individuals, governors, staff, because you're not in the roles that you do to tolerate inappropriate or offensive behaviour or treatment. And don't allow yourself to be. I spoke earlier in terms of, let me just close that down. I spoke earlier about the importance of listening actively as opposed to just hearing what people say. You know all these principles that I'm just about to share with you, and I won't labour them. But it really can help, as we all know, to try and use positive body language to demonstrate emotional intelligence, however frustrated, anxious, worried you might be. Try and contain yourselves when you might be involved in a very, very difficult or challenging situation. And as tempting as it can be, and I've been there myself, of assuming what people might be saying, or even, heaven forbid, trying to finish a sentence for somebody else. Try very hard not to do that. So although people can, of course, be very loquacious, and I know, and talk a great deal, for example, about how they feel or what they might want from you, try and let them finish if you possibly can do, because there could be something in what they say that you might find completely unexpected and actually might be quite helpful to you. And if you're not sure about what somebody's saying, or that you understand entirely what somebody's saying, just ask them. Seek clarity. Try and reiterate your understanding so that you're absolutely clear about what they may be expecting you to do or asking of you. So don't be afraid to test your own understanding. Try, of course, to neutralise your feelings as best you can, so that you're keeping how you feel very distinct and divorced from the facts and the matter that you might be discussing. And all these can really help in terms of dealing with very, very challenging emotional conversations. So what really you should be doing, try and deal with any inappropriate behaviours first and foremost, and don't wait. And really do not allow yourself to be subject to inappropriate or offensive treatment or behaviour. You really should be addressing that at the very, very earliest opportunity. Because as I said earlier, you're not in the roles that you do to tolerate inappropriate behaviour. So if you can manage to bring the behaviour back to an acceptable level, refocus on the issues that are the subject of the conversation. It could be about a school trip. It could be about where a pupil is in terms of their class and where you've allocated them in their class. It could be about the pupil progress. Whatever it may be, try and keep the two issues distinct in terms of the behaviours vis-a-vis the matter in hand. So you might be asking, well, that's all very well, Beverley, but how might I actually do that? Well, I'm a great believer in agendas, and I don't necessarily mean formal agendas in saying that, but I think it's absolutely right and proper to have an understanding about what broadly you're going to be speaking to somebody about. So if, for example, a member of staff says, oh, Mrs. So-and-so wants to see you at 4 o'clock, are you free? You may say, well, actually, yes, I am, but try and find out what Mrs. So-and-so might want to speak to you about. There's nothing unreasonable about that, so that at least you've got an indication as to what topic they may want to discuss with you. And also, of course, there may be things that you might want to discuss. So when I say set an agenda, at least have a broad agenda in terms of the conversation. And of course, I realise that that can be far easier when that conversation or that meeting is planned. But don't be afraid to have that and say, this is broadly the agenda that I think we'll be looking at. Is my understanding correct? Equally, be clear about what somebody might want as an outcome from a meeting with you. Again, I speak to so many members who say to me, oh, Beverley, the local authority have called me to a meeting tomorrow at 12 o'clock. And I say, well, why? Who will be there? How long will the meeting be for? And invariably the answer is, well, I really don't know. Find out why somebody might want to meet with you. Find out what outcome they might want from that meeting. Find out how long you might be in that meeting. These are not unreasonable requests. So make sure that you're clear about that. You know, most of us are clear why we go to the dentist or our doctor. You equally deserve clarity about why somebody might want to have a discussion with you. Again, coming back to those behaviours, check and monitor those during the meeting. Again, if they're starting to become inflated or inappropriate in any way, you know, say to somebody, do you want a couple of minutes just to regain your composure, or perhaps we'll just have a quick break and then we'll come back and meet again. Do manage the behaviours. If you think you've agreed outcomes and action points, just recap on those so that you're clear and the other individuals involved in that conversation are clear as well. And if you can follow those up in writing, even if it's just a series of bullet points following a meeting, for example, with a parent or a member of staff or a governor. Form your own judgments around that. Of course, it's not always appropriate to be following every meeting up in writing. You wouldn't be able to run your schools if you did that. I realise that. But just use your judgment on that when you think it will be wise just to document some clarity around that. I hope it goes without saying to do what you say you will do. But if you can't, and sometimes you can't for all sorts of reasons that may be out of your control, but just explain to somebody why you can't do that. And then you might want to revisit the timescales that you've committed to around that. Again, it's about managing those expectations. We talked about an agenda. Reflect closely upon that. Actually, could there be another agenda? Do I have an agenda in terms of what I might want from the outcome of any discussion? Of course, what you'd be appealing for is honesty, transparency, for somebody to be sharing with you everything they possibly could to inform any decision that you might need to make. We talked about keeping the behaviour separate and the issues separate. Equally, keep the discussion and the decision separate, because most of us have a discussion in our working lives with a view to reaching a decision. That's perfectly normal. But it doesn't necessarily mean that one and the two need to be the same. So you may have a discussion about something, but the decision around that may be quite different and quite distinct from what somebody might hope from the discussion that they have with you. We talked earlier as well about individuals' roles. You should only really be inviting appropriate individuals to contribute to a meeting or a discussion, because it begs the question, if you're not clear about the role or there's nothing really they can contribute to the discussion, they probably don't need to be there. Again, I don't doubt that many of you have attended meetings where you've been left really unclear about why somebody's been in that meeting. Could be that you've been invited to a meeting where there could be 7 or 8 people and you're left thinking, well, I don't know what they're going to be doing and why they've been invited to that meeting. So don't be afraid to ask. And again, once a decision has been made, having been informed by the discussion that you may have had, confirm that in writing as far as you can do. And of course, honour any timescales that you've made. And if they need to change, simply communicate those changes with all the parties involved in that. Schools aren't islands, as we all know. So use your governors, use your members of your trust boards, use your trustees to help you in terms of the jobs that you do. Use your regional officers, use the likes of myself to get support and advice. Use your HR advisors, your legal advisors, because they're there to support you. You can't run your schools on your own, and you're not employed to run those schools on your own. So in terms of documentation, as I touched on earlier, use follow-up letters, use notes of meetings, agreed outcomes. And if you need advice, take advice. And if you possibly can do, get that advice in writing. I've dealt with many, many scenarios where I've been saying to members, did you get that advice? You're asserting that HR advised you this. Have you got anything in writing to support that? Quite often the answer is no. So try and get your advice in writing. And one tip that I would share with you is if somebody's refusing to give advice in writing to you, just follow up your understanding of the advice that they've given. As in, my understanding from our conversation this afternoon is X. If my misunderstanding is in any way incorrect, please let me know by Y. That can be really useful and powerful if there is any challenge and misunderstanding around advice that you've received. And again, I touched upon it earlier, formal processes and procedures can be helpful. Trade union representatives can actually be helpful in terms of managing the expectations of those members. So don't be fearful of that or don't feel threatened by that. I talked earlier about the importance of time, and we're all different in our lives. Of course we are. That's the beauty of humanity, the diversity that we have. But we all have 24 hours in a day, and that's the very, very single commodity that we share as human beings. So use those hours, use them judiciously and wisely. And it's your choice to give people your time. Most people in our lives don't have a right to our time. They don't have a right to take our liberty from us. So if you want to spend, and you can spend 10, 15 minutes with an individual, do that. But if given the parameters of your working day, you can't, just explain that and say when you might be able to afford people the time that you believe they may need. And every one of you is employed because of your professional skills and competence and experience and integrity. And you don't have to justify every decision that you make to everybody, because you're there often to exercise that professional discretion within that context of the skills and experience that you do have. So don't always feel pressured to explain and justify why you've done what you have done. And those challenges could come from a parent or a member of staff. Just reflect upon that, because I know how anxious people can feel when they feel that they have to justify everything that they've done. Because you're employed to run your schools on a day-to-day basis. So ultimately, you have to make decisions around that. And as I say, you don't always have to justify every decision around that. If you're constantly facing challenges, it could be that you've reached a stage where you have to lay down some conditions for any future discussions with a member of staff or with a parent. And it could be that you've had to say, I'm not prepared to meet with you any further on this, because things may have become really quite serious and quite alarming for you. So it could be that you commit just to sending letters or emails, or only meeting with an individual where you're going to be accompanied, be it with your assistant heads or your deputy heads. And be clear, be very clear with people about what is negotiable and what isn't, because you cannot circumvent or in any way compromise the statutory duties that you have as educational professionals. You can't do that. So be clear about that and don't be afraid to articulate that. And as I touched on earlier, if matters do progress to formal processes, be very clear about what they are and ultimately where they may end up. So ultimately, if you're in a transition meeting with a member of staff in terms of their performance, and if you're concerned about the fact that the way things are going, it may be that you have to invoke a capability procedure, then you must tell them that. Okay, just a couple of slides within all of that context now in terms of parental complaints, and the principles really are very, very similar. I've worked for the NAHT for very close to 10 years now, and I've witnessed almost an exponential growth in terms of the expectations of parents on our members. So parents often expect you, I don't doubt, to be social workers, educational psychologists, paramedics. And so within that context, I think it's extraordinarily difficult now to deal with stakeholders in school, or indeed it can be, depending upon the individuals that you're dealing with. And I'm very, very aware that many, many local authorities simply do not have the resources that they had maybe even 3 years ago to offer you the support that you need in terms of the ever increasing challenges that you're facing in supporting the families that you do day in, day out. And of course, I don't doubt you face perennial threats in terms of parents going to Ofsted or the MP, or indeed even the Secretary of State. So in terms of your parental complaints policy, having a very, very clear current complaints procedure can set you in good stead for dealing with complaints expeditiously and with as least anxiety to you as possible. So make sure it's publicised, make sure that you know your procedure, make sure that your governors and your trust boards know your procedure, and critically that they actually apply that procedure, as opposed to perhaps just trying to resolve matters at the school gate, which of course isn't always appropriate, despite people's best intentions. So make sure that your governors are trained to apply the procedure and to undertake investigations if that's appropriate. The importance of complying with the data protection legislation and general data protection regulations cannot be underestimated. So make sure that you're keeping factual, accurate records in terms of complaints, and of course other areas where you're under a duty to do so, because individuals can and will make subject access requests, they will make freedom of information requests, and I'm very aware how important they are and how time consuming they can be to deal with. And I've just added a link there that I hope you'll find helpful in terms of our own model policy on parental complaints, which again really tries to avoid an adversarial, prolonged and protracted process. So when all else fails in terms of dealing with very, very difficult and challenging situations, do make sure that you're seeking legal advice as appropriate. If you need to invoke formal processes, do that. Take advice from the NAHT, take advice from your employers, from your local authorities, your trust boards. If need be, take advice from your LADO and the police. And what I would say, and I could probably run a whole session on this, is if you're in any doubt about taking advice on a safeguarding matter from your local authority designated officers or equivalent, do. Because I've represented many, many members whereby they've got into real trouble because they've not sought LADO advice when they probably should have done. But critically throughout all of this, of course, it's important that you as individuals, as human beings, as professionals, retain your own sanity. Because people who are being difficult towards you don't define your headship, they don't define your role as a senior leader. And the time that you spend on something doesn't necessarily mean it's more or less important than something else. So use your allies, use your support networks, and don't become too busy not looking after you. It's a rather cliche, isn't it, to say it's okay not to be okay, but it's so important, I think, because of the current challenges that you're facing, to make sure that you're very mindful of your own well-being as well. Because if you're not, as you well know, potentially it's going to impact upon the wider school community. And never ever forget about the fact that you've got 24 hours in a day, and use your time wisely, and don't be afraid to say to people, I can't give you the time now, but no or not now doesn't mean never. Thank you for listening to my session this morning, and I'll happily take any questions if there are any. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Beverley. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting my video on. Yeah, thank you. I know people have got other things to be pressing on with, saying one or two people drifting out. So just a quick wrap up. I had a couple of questions in that I'll just tackle, and then just a few other bits and pieces about upcoming courses. One was about, and you touched on it now, handling difficult conversations with people, particularly trade union reps or people who've been wound up by trade union reps. And I noticed you said, actually that's something you can use to your, you can turn that to your advantage, and trade union reps will be helpful in managing expectations. But is there some way we can help use that? Make sure people feel comfortable in terms of having conversations, given what they pick up from the outside world.
I think in terms of, I'll use trade union representatives for the time being, Andy. I know some of our members can feel very anxious and threatened when staff are either engaging their trade union or indeed if they're dealing with trade unions. But I think the principle is try and get to the bottom of actually what the real issues and areas of concern are. So what are the actual facts? What is it that you are allegedly causing that trade union representative's member concern? So you need to be aware of that, and what are the potential consequences of that. So if, for example, the allegation is that you're not applying your procedures, well, how? Well, first and foremost, which procedure, and how are you not applying that procedure, and how is that impacting upon that individual member? So I think that's really important, that as individuals, when you're facing challenges, you're very, very clear about what it is that's alleged you're either doing that somebody's not happy about, or that you're not doing. That's really important. It's so easy to overlook that. And I think what I was saying earlier, Andy, about not tolerating inappropriate behaviour, again, the same principles apply. Trade union representative is employed to support and represent their members. And of course, they have to do that on occasion very robustly and very rigorously. But in doing that, that's not to say that it should be done inappropriately. No. So it's about being very clear with that trade union representative or whoever it may be, what the issues of concern are, and trying to identify how you can work with that individual to address those. Because it could be that you're applying a policy that somebody doesn't like, but you're applying it fairly and consistently. And that's absolutely right and proper to do that. Now, if the suggestion is that you're in any way being inconsistent with that, you need to get the facts around that and the evidence around that. So it's about being confident, I think, Andy, as well. And equally, for our members to be robust in dealing with people who are challenging, that I accept can on occasion include other trade union representatives.
Okay, thank you. Just one last question, and I'm going to read it out because I think it's such a relevant one. The question is basically, how do I deal with the feeling of guilt that I'm not always available? And the number of times I hear that from head teachers, it's almost, I need to be everywhere all the time because I have to be a superhero. And of course, heads don't have to be superheroes, but there is very much that feeling of, I feel guilty if I'm not. What's the best way to help people sort of overcome that feeling?
Well, it's like I touched on earlier, Andy, none of us are responsible for how other people feel. But what I would invite people to do on that, and I hear that very, very often, and I think it often is as a result of just the overwhelming commitment and loyalty that our members have to their schools, to their pupils, to their families. And so they want to be everything to everybody. Yeah. Of course, none of us can be that. And I'd invite you to reflect upon how you might deal with a friend, or even a child who says, Miss, I feel guilty because of X, or reflect upon your close friends or family who may say to you, I feel guilty because I can't do this, because I can't do that, because I want to do this, 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 and this, but I just simply can't do. So I think try and step outside of that and think, what would I advise myself if somebody said to me, I'm feeling so guilty because I can't be everything to everybody? Because you can't. It's about you trying to internally manage those feelings and think, okay, I accept the fact that I can't be everything to everybody, but what can I be to the people who need my time at the most critical time, and focus on that.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. There's a perspective on it as well, doesn't it? and the phrase we're using a lot yesterday was not letting the excellent be the enemy of the good. And I think we have to be good sometimes. We're all excellent. I think we have to be settle for good sometimes. Okay, we're pretty much out of time. Thank you so much, Beverley, for your presentation. If you've heard a lot here that's interesting you, or you want to explore this in more depth in a more interactive way, the course is next Friday, the 12th of February, and you can book onto that through Eventbrite, or see more details on our website here at the NAHT. We've got a poll that's up. If you care to take time to just click through that, it won't take too long. That'll help us with our ongoing CPD needs, and helps everybody know how wonderful we think she was. So just a quick run through for courses coming up. Next week, on Monday the 8th, we've got curriculum design with Chris Quigley, which is always a very popular course, and Chris is a fantastic presenter, and do join us on that. On Tuesday, I'll be previewing our Wales conference, which is coming up in March. On Wednesday, we've got a course on executive headship with Philippa Olahead. On Thursday, we've got Jack Bastian from Diversity Role Models with a presentation on diversity. And Friday, as I say, we're back here with Beverley. So a busy week next week, and then we can all have half term, and pray God we'll get some kind of a break at this half term. And I know that'll be difficult for us. So it just remains me to say thank you so much, Beverley, for our presentation. Thank you to all of you for taking time out, either from school or from working at home, or whatever setting you're in. We do appreciate that, and thank you for being with us today. And I hope there's been lots of useful advice for you today. So, Beverley, do you want to just say a few words to wrap up?
Just really to say thank you, everyone, for your time, and stay safe and well. I hope that's been a helpful morning to you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Goodbye, everyone.